Hello. In this video, I'm going to show you how I built this animated flower. Now for this, we're going to start from absolutely nothing in Cinema 4D. We're going to model, apply materials, UV unwrap, and animate this asset, export it out, and bring it into Unreal. The goal of this is to show you how to build something from nothing and eventually import this into Unreal Engine and start stacking this inside of blueprints with different behavior to start working very quickly in a short amount of time. Starting from scratch, we're going to make a flower from the ground up. So let's start by making some petals. We're going to make a cube. Get this down to a size that we want. Thin this guy out. I'm going to give this at least one set of subdivisions on all ends, and then we're going to subdivide it. And now I'm going to stretch this out to get it to be about what I want. 60 is good. Make this slightly wider. And 1.5 gives me enough thickness. I think that's good enough for what I want this to do. Now this isn't going to be overly realistic. This is going to be a stylized blooming flower, but this will also just show you the process of how you can make something quickly and get it into Unreal. So the next step we want to do is clone these out. So I'm going to drop this subdivision surface inside of a cloner. I want this to be radial, and I want to bring this radius down to 0. So the problem we have is it's cloning all these from the center of this cube. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make this editable, and I want to move, let's turn off this cloner. I want to make this pivot at the 0 end of this, so we're cloning from the edge, not from the center. So I have this pinned. We're going to do axis center. Since we're on Z, we're going to go all the way to 0. Execute on that. Perfect. So now when I turn our cloner back on, and oh, I've got to zero this out. Reset our 0 point. So now all our coordinates are zeroed. This is looking the way that we want with our cloner, which is good. So for the time being, 5 is the number that I want. I'm going to offset this just a bit so they're either barely touching or not touching at all. And the next thing I want to do is I want to add a bend deformer to this. We can have this bend up, open, and close. So to do this, I could use the bend deformer as a child of the cube, but I really want to do it with the subdivision in mind. So I'm going to Alt-G, group this guy, so we've got another layer that the cloner's actually cloning this null and everything's contained within here. And now if I hold down Shift, we're going to add a bend deformer inside of this. So we'll turn off our cloner for the time being. I'm actually going to, we'll leave that size there. We'll just take this down to 10 on each one. We're going to turn it up and see what it's doing. So it's bending on that axis. We don't want that. So I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees, and then we're going to rotate this 90 again. So that's looking better, even though it's the wrong way. That's bending the way that we want. Okay, so now I'm going to offset this. Whoops. That's looking about right. Try to shrink this down to get this a bit closer, but that is doing what I want it to do. Widen it just a bit, and if I bend this up, perfect. So when I turn this back on now, you can see that all of these are bending. So we're just kind of stacking these up as we go. Great. So that's in place. I'm going to hide this just so we don't have to stare at it all the time. And to complete this base, I'm going to add in a sphere. It's not going to be anything earth-shattering, but I just want to have something that these can collapse into, that we can stick on the ground or whatever it is, just to kind of cover this up and then give our branch something to base off of. So 10's fine. I'm going to up this to 24, and I'm going to set this as a hemisphere because we don't need anything at the bottom. I'm going to make this editable, and then I'm going to scale this down to 60%. Looks pretty good. This gives us something just to kind of put all this together. And the sphere, we're going to call this the base. This is, everything's going to be within this. So if we move our object around, this is going to be our new parent to run everything with. So before we get to materials and animation, let's just go through and keep building these pieces out. So we've got, like I said, our bend deformer that we can now adjust these, which is great. We will come in here and we'll play with, you know, rotation to make this do a bit more of what we want, but for now we'll just keep building. I'm going to use a spline. I'm going to go into our front view. I'm going to use our spline pen. It's set to Bezier, which is what I want. And I'm going to do 3 points. So we're going to have a base. We're going to have a middle point that I'm going to give it tangent handle things. And we're going to do one more up top. And that's good. This is going to give us some points that we can bend and animate with that you'll see in a minute. So from here, we could do a sweep. So we could do a sweep, a loft, or whatever, but because these are harder to work with geometry, the easiest thing to do that's going to translate into Unreal is just to use a primitive. So I'm going to make a cylinder. Let's drop this radius down. We're going to increase our subdivisions a little bit. And I'm going to turn off the caps because they're all going to be tucked away and we don't need extra geometries. With this, the easiest way to do this is to hold down Shift, and we're going to go into spline wrap. And now that we have the spline, we drag and drop that in here. And this looks better. So positive Y is the axis that we want. We can see that we have this point. And oops, if we go in and select and start moving these, you can now see, great, we've got this stem that we want. Now this is looking a little chunky. I'm going to hide this. Okay, so that's looking a bit better, but it still looks like a cylinder. I want this to taper out as a bit at the bottom. So as you can imagine, we're going to use another modifier, but this one we are going to use taper. And now I can kind of bend and pinch this in, which is really what I want. I might use a little less curvature so it feels a bit more natural. And that's looking good. The next thing that we're going to want to do, because we're going to animate this spline, and all these pieces are going to animate, so this will grow up and it'll bend a bit, but we're going to get the last few pieces in. The final piece we're going to do is similar to the base. We're going to pretty much replicate that again, but I'm going to use a regular sphere, shrink this down, and I'm going to increase this enough that it's going to be smooth. I'm good with that. Make this editable. And I'm going to shrink this down as well, so that's just the shape that I think I want. Let's name this head. And I'm going to drop this inside of a null, so Alt-G. We'll call this head parent. And it's at the center of this, but eventually I'm probably going to want to offset this a bit. So if I do something like that, and the head is at the top of the parent, we'll go to the side view. We can see that we know this is going to attach, and I can actually just bump this up a bit, but that gives me what I want. The next thing to get this to attach to it is on this head parent. We're going to go to tags, animation, align to spline. And this we can actually connect it to this spline, which will be great. So we connect it to it and it's down at the bottom. That's because our position's at 0. If we crank this up and just leave it here, we don't need to animate it, it's going to be locked to the head of this. And to demonstrate this again, oops, grab our spline, select, and we have this top point. Now all this stuff is animating with it and everything's with this parent null. And at this point, we're going to pretty much mimic what we did down here. So we have these leaves. I'm going to duplicate these up as a child of the head. Zero this out. And now we just need to go in and edit our individual leaves again. So let's grab this bend, turn it on for the time being. We're going to just flatten this out a bit. I'm going to want these to feel a bit thicker. And at this point, I just need to adjust the vertices on each end of this so that they align a bit better and we don't have as much in the way of overlaps. So actually, we'll call this pedal because that's where we're at. Pedals, so we can keep these straight. And if we undo this, and we're going to hide our bend deformer, we've got all of our points here. So now I can go through and we're just going to taper these in a little bit. I'm going to drag these guys out to give it more of a point. Select both sides and scale it up. We're going to fatten it. And here at the back, we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to simplify it. So when I turn this back on, now I'm just going to kind of model these so they're doing about what I want. I think that's looking pretty good. So now we have a flower. But the base looks a little weird. I'm going to go through and do the exact same treatment to the base down here. Okay, so we've got our basic flower that we're going to animate and play with. So the next thing we're going to do is materials. And I know that I'm going to want one for this base and this stem, a separate one for each flower petal, head, and the bottom. So I'm going to make one. We'll call this M_leaf. We'll start down here. Add this to our leaf, and we're going to get into UVs. So for starters, I'm just going to go through, add surfaces and a checkerboard, and this is just going to help me see what my UVs are doing and make sure everything is in scale so we can do it all at once. So you can see that they pinch here on the ends, and that's due to how we stretch the geometry and we're subdividing it and all of that. So we'll go through and correct that shortly, but this will just allow us to start seeing it. I'm going to change the color of this because going to be green, and that's just going to help me see what I'm doing. And we're going to do this a few more times. And what I want to use this Petal 2 material for is do another assignment. So we're going to bring this all in as an alembic when we're all said and done, but I want to have these edges so that I can apply different materials and effects to them. So whether it's something that glows or just to give something with a bit more variation, just give me some options. So that's how. If we click on our petal here, we don't really have the extra layers of subdivision to go through and assign it. So I can't really like click faces and then assign Petal 2 because that's what it's going to look like. We don't have these edges. So since I'm happy with this, we could duplicate this down here at the bottom and hide it if we needed to come back to it. But I'm just going to delete it and we're going to commit this. So I'm going to middle click on this, and I want to go to connect and delete objects. I'm good with this. We've got our new petals. So now there is no more subdivision surface. We just have the geometry. So I'm going to hit UL. I'm going to do a loop selection. I'm going to select this one. Actually, we're going to turn off our cloner so we can see what we're doing. So right down the middle, I'm going to hit UI, and I'm just going to expand this a couple times just so I'm getting up and around the side, and that's what I want. And now I'm going to right click and apply, and now we have Petal 2. So when I activate everything again, now we have these edges that you'll see we'll add some different effects to and have some fun with. And that's it as far as materials go. So the next section is we're going to quickly UV unwrap these just so our checkerboards are looking like even checkerboards. So we don't need this anymore. We're going to go through piece by piece, and we'll do this pretty quick. So go to the UV Edit tab. We're going to start with our leaves. So I've got my excuse me. I've got my faces selected. I'm going to Control A, just select all. And for most of this, I'm just going to use automatic UV and cubic. And since we're starting with a cube, should do a pretty good job. Yeah, but not so much. So we'll try packed and usually just try a few of different ones of these to see what works. And if these don't work, we're going to go through and try different projections on all of these. And I'm not really liking any of these. So that's not going to unwrap well on its own. So I think what I'm going to do is just commit this as well and get rid of the subdivision. So we're going to merge all of this so we're back to our regular cube. And it's not as many layers to adjust from, which, I mean, if you wanted to do half the time when I'm doing this, what I'll do is I'll just do connect objects. I will keep a spare in a folder. I'll just title this work in progress. If I want to go back to these pieces, I can and just hide them, and I just won't export that part. That just gives me another layer to work with, and now this cube is like this. So come back in here and let's try this again. So now when I go to unwrap this, this is already going to do a much better job because I've got the sides, which I don't care about as much, but the faces are looking better. And now when I go to look at this, this checkerboard looks a lot better. So we'll stick with that. We can always come back if we want to go back to these petals and try them again, but now it's all going to be committed. So let's keep going. Let's keep going. This base, I think I'm okay with it. We'll try to unwrap it and just see if it's any better. I don't like that seam. I think I'm going to undo it and just leave it going more towards the center there. We'll try a couple other options and see if it's any better. Sphere, cylinder, none of these are really doing a great job, so we'll just leave this as it is. Man, even though those are kind of chunky and weird. Yeah, I think this is the route I'm going to go. I'll leave these base. And if I really wanted to, I could probably just bring this up a bit, which is probably actually a good idea anyways. That gives a little extra overlap. Just going to hide that seam a little bit. And that works for me. That looks less like a half-baked sphere. And the next one. We're going to make our cylinder editable as well. This one's actually looking pretty good. So another way you can do your UVs in here is to stretch through the tag. So you could come into transform. We could select all of these, and you could apply scale values to try to stretch these and make them, try to get these right in the window. But the faster way that actually does export is if you use your UV tag, we can go through and stretch the length. So we're going to make this bigger or smaller. Let's see, which I want to try to get these to match close enough. So let's try 200 and 50, 40. Those are looking like they're pretty close to the base that it's on. So we're going to use the same material for these. I want these to be pretty close just so it's not noticeable, and that should be good enough for now. And I will give the disclaimer, I would usually take a lot more time trying to do this, but for the sake of the tutorial, I want to get through this fairly quickly so you can see how this works. I'm going to leave the UVs on the sphere at the top. I'm fine that they bend in. I don't care that much, but I do care about the petals. So we're going to go back through and we're going to do all of these again. So automatic, cubic, and just like that, that's looking pretty good. And you'll also notice too that our checkerboard on our second material does align with this. So it's a little weird at the sides. I'm planning on making this an emissive material, so I'm good with that, but you could take more time and try to get these a little bit tighter. And actually, we'll go with packed instead of cubic. Great, UVs are done. We have our materials, we have our UVs. Now we're ready to animate, and then we're going to export. So let's collapse that. Let's open up our animation tab. And we're going to have this in 3 parts. We're going to have these leaves go up and encapsulate this. The stem is going to grow out while these leaves expand, and then we're going to bloom these flower petals. And we'll do all this over the course of, we'll do 2 seconds. And we can speed this up in Unreal if we would like to. So let's start with, actually let's organize first. So we're going to add all of these pieces inside of the base. Rename this to leaf. So that's going to show up stem. Everything else is named well enough. So let's start with our leaf. We're going to do this in two parts. We're going to use the bend deformer, which probably should name these, and our cloner. Actually, let's go to, so under our cloner, on the transform, I want to collapse these up like this. And we're going to do a few things to get this to work. So let's get to a starting point. Let's do 45. And I'm going to keyframe this. And then I'm going to go into bend. Okay, undid my naming, leaf. And I'm going to bend this up even tighter. So we'll start with 96, or minus 96. And then we'll have this go over the course of 1 second. So we go back to our leaf. We can now expand this down to about like that. So we'll do -5. I'm good with that. We go back to our bend deformer and let's make this relax a bit. And now we've got this closing and opening, which is looking good. But the only problem we have now is that our leaves are not expanding. And this is where we're going to, this whole thing is using point level animation, which is kind of where Alembic really holds a lot of its power. And what we can do to fix this is we're just going to use point level animation. So there's other ways that you can choose to do this, but I'm going to kind of do the quick and dirty method on this. I'm going to go into points. I'm going to select these sides. I'm going to go to soft selection over on the side. We're going to enable this. And we're going to see. Switch to scale mode and scale this in. I want to see. It's pinching a bit, so I want this to expand out from there. So let's increase our radius to 75 and see if that's going to do it. Not bad. Up this to 100, test that, and I think that's going to be what I want this to be. So this is our endpoint. We're going to go to where this is ending, and then down here you'll see if we click this record active object and we just make a keyframe, it's going to record position, rotation, scale, and parameters. I'm going to turn off all of these, and we're going to turn on point level animation. So when we keyframe this, we are just recording the position of all of these vertices. So now that I've got our vertices selected, where it's going to end, we're going to hit keyframe. And I'm going to drag this leaf in here so we can see it. So we've got our keyframe here. We're going to come back to the beginning. And now I'm just going to scale this in to about to what I want. And that looks like that's going to close up the way I want it to. And we're going to keyframe again. So now this guy expands a bit as it goes down. So we start nice and tight, but these actually get a little bit wider and fill out at the bottom. Great. So there's our leaves. Those are looking pretty good. We'll come back in and play with the easing in a minute so it doesn't feel quite like this, but we'll do that once we get everything else done. I'm going to skip ahead and do the flower. I want the exact same thing with this as well. So if we jump up to our petals, we're going to find our rotation on P or pivot. I don't remember. But rotation on P. We're going to keyframe it at the end, go back to the beginning, and let's close this thing up. Start with 60, and then we can adjust it down here as need be. So this expands as well. Same deal with our bend. Go to the end point. Got our starting, keyframe it, go back to the beginning, and let's bend this back so that it closes about how we want it to. That's not bad. Give it a little bit of room, and we'll keyframe that. So the other thing is this is expanding up. We're going to come back and adjust this a bit more and kind of fine tune it. I'll probably speed up through that as we go. But I also want to play with the scale of some of these too. So this is another way. You don't have to do the point level animation like I showed you. We can actually scale stuff down in here, which is what we're going to do. So I'm going to go to the end. We're going to scale all of these. And we're doing this in our cloner so that it's not using the point level animation in Cinema, even though it's going to export that. And now we're going to just pull these down into something much tighter. We'll do 0.35 for both of these. Kind of really shrink these leaves down for all of these. And I'm also going to tighten this up even further. So now when this opens, it's going to expand, and we'll play with this easing so it looks less obvious at the next section. Okay, so our flower is expanding. That's looking great. Before we get into the easing part and retiming this, we're going to now do the last part of this, which is going to be adjusting this spline. And same thing here, we're going to record the actual points of this spline. We're also going to record the height. So we're going to go to our endpoint again, scale Y, set a keyframe there, go back to the beginning, and we're going to just pull this down inside. So 0.5 looks good, keyframe that, and now as this thing opens, you've got this animation. And the only other thing that I really want to do is these are all just going to be facing straight up. They're going to look a little robotic, and since we can scatter these around and play with rotation in Unreal, I want to add just a bit of bend to this. So I'm going to grab this, select all of the points, and just so you can see what I'm doing here, I've got all three of our spline points selected. We're going to set a keyframe. I'm going to pull this spline in to make sure that the PLA is working, which it is. We're going to go to the end, and now I'm going to grab the top a bit and just pull it over, maybe. Okay, so I figured out what I was doing wrong. Soft selection was actually on, so when I went to get this point, I did not realize that soft selection was enabled. That's not going to allow me to move the spline. So if we turn that off, now we can move it. So we'll go back to the beginning, select all of our points for the spline. We're going to keyframe our point level animation. We're going to go back to the end, just select this top one and bend it just a bit. And keyframe this. And I'm going to select this middle point, and we're just rotate this a bit and just kind of bend this into place so it's looking more the way that I want. Keyframe that, and now we go back to the middle. I think that's going to do about what I want. Great. The only thing that's not working now is the head, and we can just keyframe this, and we should be about out of the basic of the animation. So the head parent, that is what I want, pretty sure. Yes. So now I'm just going to go back to the beginning. We've got our rotation axis, and we're just going to finish pushing through this and get this to I like that, -9. And this will just give us enough variation now that it's asymmetrical. When we spin these around, they'll be kind of facing different directions and appear like they've got a bit more weight. So that's animating. When we check this playback speed, it kind of all bursts out at once. What I'm going to do is take the, let's see, drag the pedals in. We're going to drag our bends in. So I want the bend on the pedals. So I can see what I'm doing. I'm going to select these and the pedals, and we're just going to offset these a little bit. actually going to stretch them a bit. And I can sit and just kind of tweak this, but the main thing I want to do is select the leaves, the leaf, pretty much everything. And I'm going to go through and just adjust the easing on it. So we're going to bring these back so that they shoot out much quicker. And then we're going to take these endpoints and drag these out so our easing is a bit more aggressive. So if I'm going to go to the leaf and our leaves, stretch these way back, and I want these to kind of start without any easing. So these are going to kind of shoot open. I want to go back to the leaf. And we're going to stretch these all the way to the end. And I'd probably sit here for another 30 minutes just noodling this whole thing and playing with it, but for now, I think this is going to work. Actually, the last thing I'm going to do is the spline. Just expand this out because that looks a little bit better. Good enough for phase one. So we have our animation and everything else that's in here. So now we are ready to export. The last thing we just need to do is this base. We're going to export this and all of its children. So one thing you need to keep in mind is that when you export out a cloner, if you don't connect everything inside of it, when you take this into Unreal as an alembic, it's only going to give you one leaf or one of its clones at a really weird spot. And we don't want that. So the easiest thing to do is select our base. We're going to hold down Alt, and we're going to throw this inside of a connect. We're going to go to Object and turn off Weld, because we don't want this to weld any vertices. And after that, it still looks the same, but this is now going to merge everything into this. So we'll call this Flower Bloom. We're going to save. I'm going to middle click on this, and you could do, we're going to export as Alembic. So you could do File, Export, Alembic. I've pinned it to the top because I use this a ton. 60 frames, that's what we're using. Everything else looks like it should be ready to go. So we're going to hit OK, Alembic, Flower Bloom 2. That's the one we're working on. And now we're going to be ready to bring this into Unreal. All right, we're in Unreal. Great. We have grass and sky. Perfect situation to make a flower grow. So let's make it grow. Here's our Alembic folder. Pretty easy thing to do. Actually, I've got a set folder here called Flower Bloom. Here's our file. Let's import Flower Bloom 2 into our Flower Bloom 2 folder that we made in advance because we're so prepared. The import type we want is going to be geometry cache. This is going to bring all that point level animation that we animated and did with cloners and the bend deformers and all that. This is going to bring that in. Flatten tracks we want unchecked because it's terrible and kills your materials. Down under materials, we want to check create materials so that it will make a new material for every slot that's in there, and it just makes it easier to replace them when we can see them. And under conversion, under rotation, I rotate this 90 degrees on the x-axis so that it's going to point upright. It doesn't always work that way with FBX, but for Alembic, I do this every time, and it just saves a step. And when we import this in, we now have a bunch of broken materials, but they are assigned to this guy. So we're going to bring our object in, and I'll just add, hold down V, we're just going to add a color to one of these so we can see what we're doing. Let's make it red. So I won't show it in this tutorial, but usually I would go through and do a much more detailed work on the materials and a lot of applying. But for the sake of just showing how this imports, this will get you close enough. So here's our flower. We have a sequence open in our sequencer, and the last thing we want to do is just check this. So if we import our flower, Go up to track, geometry cache, and now you'll see this thing is expanding exactly how we want it. And at this point, you can kind of go through and set up a bunch of these. You can duplicate these flowers and scatter a bunch around, and watch how these things work. And really, you can kind of go through and just keep updating and overriding and re-exporting and re-importing as you want to iterate on these things. And that's it.